Salam everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's session. It's, as you'll know, it's on personal statements and CV writing. So we're going to commence. We'll start with 3 orms and then we'll go through the introductions. Om. 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 Thank you for joining the session. So tonight we're going to cover 2 topics: how to write a personal statement, so the do's and don'ts, the structure, etc. And then secondly, we're going to cover how to write a CV, so a few a few tips on how to style it, structure it, and at the same time going over some do's and don'ts. So we have with us Brother Kirti, who's kindly going to be leading on personal statements. He's going to talk about, like I said, how to write a personal statement, and then I will be followed by myself, who will talk about writing a CV. Now, in terms of the format, we will basically have about 20 minutes where Brother Kirti will talk about writing this personal statement, and then there's some time for Q&A, and then we'll move on to writing a CV, and similarly we'll have Q&A at the end. I know some of you have submitted questions, so the plan is to cover that during our presentations, but of course, if you feel like the question hasn't been answered or hasn't been covered, feel free to ask it at the end. Equally, during the presentations, if you feel like you have a there's a question that you'd like to ask, feel free to unmute or put it into the chat, and I will either ask Kirti at the end, Brother Kirti at the end, or we'll perhaps I'll interrupt him during the presentation. For those of you who are just interested in personal statements, feel free to drop off the call after the first half of the session. So I'm now going to hand over to Brother Kirti. Before I do so, I'm just going to basically share my screen. So 1 second, please. Sorry. 1 second. Cool. Can everyone see that? So can you see a slideshow? Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Over to you, brother. Let me mute myself.
Saram there, everyone. Could I just confirm if you could all hear me correctly?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that as well, Brother Saiwaran. So today we're going to be talking about personal statements, and this is a big stage for those of you who are now applying to university. Just a little bit about myself. I finished my undergraduate studies this year at Cass Business School, which some of you may know as Bays, and I'm right now doing my master's at the London School of Economics, known as LSE. So, personal statements. This is a very important document that you will be applying with for your 5 university options. You must be showing your skills, experience, and your passion in your personal statements, but most importantly, the motivation you have for the program that you're applying for. For those of you who are applying to Oxbridge or for medical programs, it's particularly important as well because your personal statement will be used as a rough reference for any interviews you may face. Now, for those of you studying apprentice or looking to apply for degree apprenticeships, there might not necessarily be a personal statement stage. However, the structure of creating a personal statement is something that is very important and something that you may use later on. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So what should you be writing about? The main thing is you want to showcase why you're suitable to study at the institutions you're applying for. And a recommendation that I often give to students is to look at the ethos or the mottos of the universities that they're applying for and trying to essentially group them together and then later embedding that in the personal statements that you write. So just an example for KCL, I believe the Latin translation for their motto falls along the lines of uh, wisdom, etc. So ideally, you want to showcase a sort of intellectual curiosity you have. And this could be through the EPQ you may have done during your year 12 years, or any research project you may have done again during your secondary school years to really showcase that through. Again, as you can only write one personal statement, it's also important not to be too specialized towards one course. Remember, you're applying for 5, so it's good to keep that sort of general gist for the courses that you're applying for, but really tailoring it towards them. Now, a question that several of you asked was, how can you really showcase this? And what I always recommend is for students to look at the programs they're applying for and specifically looking at the modules. And in other words, modules are going to be subjects that you're studying at university. And what you should do is go through these modules and highlight any keywords you find. So, for instance, if you're looking to study something in biomedical sciences, often drug development might be coming up across these modules. So you can later throw that into your personal statement and slightly expand on it and then tie it back into why you're motivated to studying this course. So definitely looking through modules and really understanding them and putting these keywords in is something that I would definitely recommend. Speaking about your ambitions, not just your ambitions during your undergraduate course, but also your ambitions post university and what you hope to really gain out of the university. That is something that I would really emphasize you do and really showcase again through your personal statement. Now, showcasing again away from your academics. Academics are so crucial to your personal statement, but you must also talk about your extracurricular activities. And this can include any societies, clubs, or any skills you've developed by taking part across these during your secondary school years. Another question that was put from the SSC students was about your relevant work experience. And if you have a lot of work experience, what should you do? Now, I would recommend really narrowing down your work experiences and emphasizing how this relates to the course that you're studying and what you learned from that experience in relation to your course, and making sure they're very much linked. So, for instance, if you did a week of experience at a pharmacy and you're applying for economics course, maybe see if there's any alternative. However, if you are lacking experience, maybe you can talk about the business, the revenue side, and the marketing side of working at the pharmacy and then incorporating that in for your degree. So that is just a way of sort of tailoring it if you don't have as much experience, because this is something really important that academic admission staff are looking for. And then again, if you've done any additional courses, so for instance, I know that Imperial run a summer school, and a lot of students have spoken about it, and it really helps them again during their personal statement writing journey. So yeah, moving on to the next slide, please.
This is irrelevant to me. Right. This part seems to be a bit irrelevant.
What?
Irrelevant. Not about education, like
Sorry, sister, did you ask a question or did you have you just been unmuted? Okay, I think someone just accidentally unmuted. But for those of you online, if you can just keep yourself muted unless you want to ask a question.
Okay, thank you for that, brother. In terms of any personal circumstances, so when you are applying for university, you may have certain instances where you might need to defer or anything that could essentially upset you from completing your personal statement. Now, I would heavily recommend you speak to your teachers at secondary school, and they will really guide you through this process Often, students do not realize how much support they have from their teachers. So definitely get into contact with them if there are any personal circumstances that you face when writing your personal statement. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So how to write it. In terms of writing a personal statement, again, the structure of it was how, what would you include? I would always say that a nice way to start off with your personal statement is about is using an anecdote. So, in my case, I spoke about the Sri Lankan economic crisis, the before and after, and how that essentially motivated me to pursue my undergraduate degree that was very much financial aligned. In terms of who you can ask to read over your personal statement, I would definitely recommend your teachers. They have placed students into the courses that you're ideally going for, so definitely get into contact with them. The other person or other group of people you should get involved with are students who are currently completing the actual undergraduate degree themselves. And what you could do potentially is see students from the same school that you attend and see where they've gone off to, and later maybe get into contact with them. This could be through a simple LinkedIn message and just asking them what was essentially key elements that they incorporated to get onto the program that you really want. Now, being enthusiastic about your subject, this is so important because you need to not just be conveying a story. A lot of students end up becoming very narrative with what they're saying, but at the end of the day, this is a 4,000 character document where you're really trying to sell yourself with your academic achievements, the extracurriculars you've done, and on top of that, any other relationships that you've made outside of the school in relation to this course. So again, please don't narrate too much and get to the point. In terms of the limit, I'm sure all of you will know that there are 4,000 characters and 47 lines. So again, every word is so precious in your personal statement, and there is no need for instance, very long quotes, which I believe will be covered in the upcoming slides. Now, again, SPAG is so crucial. I know Brother Sai Warren will convey this again in the CV session. If you have SPAG errors, it's a simple case that admission staff will point that out, and that's how difficult it is getting into university these days. It's the excellence and academic rigor that they'll be testing with your personal statement. This is really an opportunity to sell yourself, so perfection is so important. And again, a good way to do this is to proofread paragraphs backwards. So the general do's and don'ts to do is to get to the point from the get-go. Really be enthusiastic. You want to show your character why you are really fit for this course. And one thing is to really, you will be writing several drafts. I remember during my stages of writing personal statements, I'd written two, and then I thought this was good. Yet later, speaking to my teachers, senior students who were on the course, I later realized there was a lot of tweaking that was necessary. So definitely be prepared for this. Devote 80% to academic material. Now, I do believe there's a new structure with the way personal statements are written into 3 questions, and one of the questions is aligning with the selection of your subjects and why this is relevant for you. Really hone in on your subjects and essentially express how this will be helping you across your undergraduate degree. Now, the don'ts, please do not copy. Each personal statement is scanned through a document or a processor, and essentially, if you have any sort of plagiarism, it will be flagged, and your personal statement will be sent to a separate file and won't be looked at. Exaggerating your skills, as mentioned before, if you're applying to Oxbridge or medical programs, you will be facing interviews, and if you've exaggerated your skills, you will be identified that you don't hold these, and it will make it really difficult for you going forward. Relying on spell checker. I mean, if you are asking additional individuals to read through your personal statement, hopefully you won't need to use a spell checker, and leaving it to last minute. Now, I believe the deadline is sometime around January, but I would definitely recommend getting it in as early as possible. The reason for this is especially for year 13 students, you'll be having your A levels coming up. You want to maximize your revision time. So the earlier you do it, the better. And then you can also receive more advice from your teachers or fellow peers. Spending too long on the opening line. And again, this is going back to the anecdote that I spoke about. Definitely narrate and provide that character, but there should not be paragraphs and endless paragraphs of you sort of trying to depict a story. And again, avoid as much narration as possible. Include references you couldn't expand on in an interview. Again, several times there'll be students who are caught out during the interview stages, so do not give them that opportunity to catch you out. And do not overthink. The personal statement is a reflection of you, hence personal. So really show that again and make sure you're able to convey why you are most fit for that course. Moving on to the next slide. So the cliches from a young age, for as long as I remember, when someone on the academic team are looking through it and they find personal statements that continuously start with the same lines, it could be an indication that, for instance, AI has been used. So that's something you just want to avoid, really. And again, famous quotations. I spoke about how scarce these words and characters are for your personal statements. So really try and be careful of what you're including. So if you really think it's necessary, maybe go for a quote. However, again, think about the word count. Now, the final point on books that everyone has read, I would say something more interesting to talk about are academic papers or research papers from institutions you're looking to apply for. And the way you can find these, for instance, if you are looking to go to UCL and you're studying again, maybe biomedicine, you can type in UCL stem cell research papers, and I'm sure there will be some sort of documents that will come up and have a look through them, and maybe you could reference them if you find them truly interesting in your personal statement, as opposed to using a book that a lot of people will be quoting. Yeah. So, as Swami says, students strive to demonstrate your purity in every field of activity. Do not study for degrees alone, study for self-satisfaction. I hope this was informative, and any other further questions, please, students, come forward and ask. Thank you.
Thank you, brother, for that. So, like I said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now, or you can unmute and ask the question. Else, we'll be moving on to CV writing shortly. I'm just checking in the chat. Any questions from anyone? If you do have any questions, so just as a follow-up, these are Brother Keithy's contact details, so I'll send this slide deck out to those of you who've registered. Else, if you haven't registered, please contact me afterwards and I can forward these on, but he's kindly offered to help with any questions, or if you need any assistance, he's offered to help. So please reach out to him if you do have any questions. Okay, I'm now going to move on to CV writing. So thank you, brother, for joining us today and discussing how to write a personal statement. So we've had a lot of questions about CV writing, and to be honest, there's been a mixture of questions, some from clearly people who are just starting out in their career, and others who are perhaps a bit later on in their career, or have had a gap, for example. Now, I'm firstly going to just talk about what a CV is, how to structure it, the do's and don'ts, and then later on I'll go into some of those questions because some of them are quite detailed. But let's start from the top. What is a CV? So a CV is a marketing document. You need to think of it as a way to sell yourself. So some of you might have heard of the sort of elevator pitch. So this is a concept that if you were to meet someone, what would you say to them in 30 seconds about yourself to basically pitch who you are? Because imagine you're in an elevator, you've only got about 30 seconds together. The CV is the same thing. And to be honest, these days, in the age of AI, this concept is even more relevant because most companies these days, the way it works is when you apply online or through some portal, a machine, AI will basically scan through your CV before it then gets filtered through, and then a select group of CVs then go to the hiring manager or HR, who actually, that's when a human gets involved and reads the CV. So it's really important that you're aware of what you're putting on that CV, making sure that it's tailored to the actual job that you're applying for and it fits all the criteria. So as it says here, you need to really make sure that the employer gets the impression that you're worth interviewing. And the way they do that is they look for key skills, knowledge, evidence of those sort of things. Again, you can't cover everything that you've done in your life on a CV because ultimately it's a 1 or 2 page document. So it needs to be very focused, but it needs to give them enough information such that they have the confidence that you've got the right skills to be employed. Now, how do you go about putting together that CV? Like, how do you go about getting the content together, making sure it fits the relevant job? Well, this is where you need to actually do some research into the type of job that you're applying for. So for example, if you're applying for something in academia, then you need to kind of think about, okay, what sort of field am I going into? What's the department, etc.? What would I be doing in that space? In industry, what sort of products are you working on? The type of department, the organization. This is the sort of stuff that you basically need to have a sense for, because when you're imagine you're applying for a job with, say, at a fast food outlet, for example. If you don't tailor it to the fast food industry or like the food industry, and you write about your experience working, say, as a nurse, it's not really going to be relevant. They're not going to understand why you'd want to actually work at said company. So that's why it's really important to do your research first, so you make sure that you're aligned with what the company is looking for. Now, going on to evidence. So how do you evidence why you're a good fit for a role? Now, this changes throughout your career. So when you first start out, so when you're a student, i.e. you're 16, 18, perhaps even 21, your CV is going to look very different to someone who's, say, 50. And it's very obvious because your experience evolves and changes over time. Now, the whole point about the CV is it's supposed to give a snapshot of who you are. Like I said, it's marketing material, right? It's the elevator pitch. So there's different areas of your life that you can basically draw upon and put into your CV to kind of pitch yourself. So when you're early on in your career, to be honest, the only experience or the most relevant experience you're going to have is your academic background, because ultimately you'd have spent the bulk of your life at school, perhaps at college, university, etc. So that's what you should focus on. Obviously, if you do have some extra experience, either volunteering or even work experience, or you've actually worked somewhere, then you can include that. But the point is, you need to make sure that you sell the stuff that you have. So there's no point trying to write, say, 10 lines about some work experience that you did for a week, because it's not, that doesn't really tell much to an employer versus you talking about what you've done at university, where you've probably spent 3 years studying a degree. So try and fit it according to your experience to date. So like I said, if you've been at university and you're just applying for a job, then obviously the focus around what you studied at university, those modules, etc., are very relevant. Again, if you've had any success, scholarships, that sort of thing, put that down, because that shows some sort of excellence. Now, moving on, if you've had a bit more experience, so like I said, if you've done some practical work, again, these days at university, there's a lot of, I remember even in my time, but when you're at university, there are lots of opportunities to build up your experience in various different fields. So there was this sort of university competition where we basically spent a week together in groups and basically pitched a business idea to some industry professionals. So this wasn't really a real world work experience per se, but it was an opportunity for us to use some of our skills that we learned at university into sort of a real life experience. So again, you can draw upon these experiences and put that in your CV. For those of you who've also, perhaps written some publication, published some articles, attended any sort of conferences, things like that, you can put those things in because it shows your experience in doing, and especially if it's relevant to what you're applying to, then it shows that, you're working towards a goal. So put those sort of things down. Now, the last 2 points are critical. So if you've got any work experience, definitely put that down in your CV. And this is applicable to everyone who's applying for a job. So let's say, for example, you're applying for a job at a law firm or an accounting firm, and you've just gone to university, and then you've also had a side job, say, at Next. You should definitely put that down, because even though it's not relevant per se to the role you're applying for, there are obviously some skills that you can sort of draw upon in your CV that might be relevant to the job. And so in that instance, it's actually useful to put that work experience down, because it shows the prospective employer that, okay, you don't have experience, say, in finance or law, but you've got experience working and you know how to do some basic things. Now, if you were to progress 10 years down the line and you work, say, at that financial firm, or you've worked at that legal firm for 10 years, at that point, it's actually perhaps less relevant to put your work experience at Next, because obviously you've spent 10 years working in the industry. So at that point, you really need to actually sort of rejig your CV and essentially talk about the things that you've done in recent years, because obviously you've gone into a different field. So going back to my earlier point about the marketing pitch and those 30 seconds, if you had 30 seconds to describe yourself, the way you describe yourself at the age of 20 will be different to the way you describe yourself at 30 or 40 or 50. So this is why your CV is something that needs to constantly be updated, almost yearly, because it will evolve as you get more experience, more skills. Finally, and this is often a common question that people ask, interests and achievements. There's nothing wrong with putting down some of your interests and achievements, especially outside of work. So I remember, when I started off, I used to put down like some of my extra sort of curricular activities, things like sports and things that I like doing. There's nothing wrong with that, because again, it just shows there's a personal side to you, and employers often they're looking to employ someone, but they want someone with, some balance, some character. They don't want a robot. So there's no harm putting in just one line in terms of some of your extracurricular activities. I think one of the questions posed was, should you mention your sort of involvement in a SI organization, or if you have a role? Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with putting that down. And the key takeaway is it actually shows the prospective employer that there's a different side to you. You're not just someone who works. You've got time for volunteering, doing something that is less common versus some of the peers. So it actually helps you stand out. So don't hesitate to actually write about some of the things that you do outside, whether it's at the site in the site organization or even any general volunteering. So basic principles in terms of how to structure the CV. So as I mentioned before, you need to make sure that you research the sector.
These are things where you can write to them. Sorry. Close.
Is someone asking a question, or?
Sorry, I've just joined, but I don't know whether you accepted me or not.
Yeah, you're online. You're online. We can hear you.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, if you could just go on mute, please, that would be helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll do that, really.
Mute.
So, basic principles in terms of writing a CV. So, again, this is another question. Should you have different CVs for different jobs? Now, the short answer for this is it actually depends. So, if you think about it, imagine if you had to describe yourself, like I said at the start, the elevator pitch, 30 seconds, you have 30 seconds to basically describe yourself to someone else. If you had 10 different versions of that, that's quite hard for you to actually recall those 10 different versions if you were to describe yourself in 10 different ways, right? Equally, the same principle applies to a CV. If you had 10 different CVs and they're quite different, it's actually going to be quite hard for you to recall all 10 CVs. And this is quite critical, but when you get to an interview, because in any job they always interview you, what the basic concept is, in an interview they will talk through your CV. The first sort of 10-20 minutes of any interview, always the first thing the employer does is talking through your CV, talking through your experience. So if you've got 10 different CVs, it's actually going to be quite hard for you to recall what you've put down in each CV. So my advice is actually don't have multiple CVs, i.e. 10, but there's no harm in having 2 or 3. Now, the reason why I say 2 or 3 is in some instances, and typically this happens early on in your career, but early on in your career, perhaps you're unsure of what sort of job or field you'd like to apply to, or for example, you're just looking for a job at the start, so you're willing to sort of apply to different areas. In those instances, you do need to, especially if you're applying to different industries, you're applying for a grad scheme in law as well as accounting, you do need to tailor your CV slightly, because if you're applying for a law firm and you talk about experience at an accounting firm, for example, they might think it's a bit odd. And vice versa, if you're applying for an accounting firm, like a role in an accounting firm, and you just mention your experience in the legal sector, they'll think it's slightly odd. So you do need to tailor your CV slightly, but the general advice is don't have too many CVs, but try and have 1 or 2 if you're applying to slightly different sectors. But like I said, the key thing, and this is at the start, is making sure that your CV aligns to what the employer wants. So if you ever look through a job description, and to be honest, these days, life is a lot easier actually with AI, but employers typically put down the skills that they're looking for. In every job description, they describe the company, then the actual job, and then the key skills that they want. Now, when you're writing your CV, you need to make sure that you're hitting those skills. So if they say, for example, they want someone who has the ability to sort of present new ideas to, or for example, pitch new ideas to a wide audience, for example, you need to talk about, okay, what sort of experience do I have, or what skills I have to showcase my ability to go and present to other people. So even if it's something as simple as at university, you led a project and then you presented something to a panel of judges, those are the sort of things that employers are looking for in a CV. Now, order. So there's different styles with CVs, and this is the thing. If you go online and type in CV and you look for a template, you will see a myriad of different templates. So there's no right or wrong, but to be honest, my personal view on this is to actually put the most important information right at the start and give it the most attention, and then the other things later down. And the reason for this, and I'll explain why, is from experience. Pretty much every interview I've ever been to, the employer has never actually read my CV. And this is something that I've picked up on over the years, mainly because I've gone to the interview and you can tell from the person's face on the other side that they're basically just looking at the CV now. Now, this is quite common because most hiring managers, when they're looking, looking to hire someone, they're inundated with CVs. And so they don't really have too much time to actually go through each CV. So they typically will go to HR, human resources, ask them to sort of scan through CVs and basically submit those that sort of fit the skills that they're looking for. And then the hiring manager will typically look at them the day of the interview, or sometimes, a lot of the cases, on the day at the moment of the interview commencing. So because of that, what you really want to do is, if you think about the person, especially who's initially scanning it, i.e. HR, they're only going to spend, I think, the statistic I read is most people on average spend about 30 seconds reading a CV. So if you're going to spend 30 seconds reading a CV, you're going to remember the stuff at the start rather than the stuff at the end, because after about 30 seconds you're probably going to have perhaps zoned out. And don't forget, someone in HR will be reading through typically hundreds and hundreds of CVs, sometimes every day, because they're basically looking for candidates across a wide range of jobs. So because of that, it's really important to put your key information at the start, and then all the other bits like volunteering experience perhaps, or extracurricular activities or hobbies later at the back end of the CV. So my advice in terms of structuring it is, you can put your name, your contact details, for example, your email or your phone number. You don't need to put both. And then put your educational experience at the top. For example, if your most recent experience is university, put that, and then maybe put your A-level results. And then go into your sort of work experience if you have some, and then hobbies, interests, other volunteering experience. So that's the structure that I've always followed. For those of you who have a bit more experience, you can now also include a summary of yourself, i.e. 3 or 4 lines where you summarize your experience. Like, for example, if you're a doctor, you can say, you know, I have over 10 years of experience in the medical industry working as a psychologist, for example, or a rheumatologist working across such and such field. So that just gives them a sort of a high level overview of who you are. Format, make it easy to read. I mean, this sounds obvious, but people do all sorts of things to sort of make the CV stand out. Some people put it in really small writing so that they can fit more words into it. My philosophy always with any form of writing is, imagine you had to pay £1 million for every letter on a document. How would you write that document? So it's not about how much you write, it's more about the quality. Now, again, another question was, you know, how many sides should a CV be? And there's different answers to this. Some people say you need 2 sides, some people say 3. To be honest, the optimum is 2, but early on in your career, i.e. when you're first starting out, there's nothing wrong with having a one-sided CV. So for the best part of probably 6-7 years, up until 6-7 years into my career, I only had a 1-page CV, one side. And the main reason for that is I basically kept it very concise and I didn't have a lot of work experience. After I'd been through 2 or 3 jobs, my CV expanded into 2 sides, just namely because I had, you know, a lot of work experience. So I could talk about those 3 jobs that I'd worked in. But at the start, there's no need to really basically put down, you know, just lots of information in there just to sort of try and sell yourself. And I've seen this on countless occasions with university students who basically don't have a lot of practical work experience, but then basically sort of elongate their description of their university course. Concise is actually better. It's more about getting those skills, those keywords in, rather than just writing sort of 3 paragraphs on what you've done at university. There are a few questions also on things like photos and other things. These days, employers are very sensitive to that sort of information, partly because they don't want to be seen to discriminate against anyone. So even if you put your CV in through a portal and you put a photo in, typically the system will actually remove the photo because they don't want to be prejudiced. So there's no point putting a photo in. Like I said, imagine you've only got a small amount of information. You know, you've only got a page to write, or you've got very little space. Think about how you would actually convey everything you want to write. So don't waste space, you know, having a little section where you sort of summarize your skills. Talk about your skills within the actual body, i.e. what you've done at university. Bring those skills out. Another common thing that I've seen over the years is attention to detail, people making spelling and grammatical errors. To be honest, in the age of AI, there's no excuse for this because you can run your CV through ChatGPT, and to be honest, it's pretty good at picking out errors. So there's no excuse. But having said so, don't just rely on ChatGPT. Read through your CV and basically really make sure that it's perfect. Again, going back to my earlier tip about 30-second elevator pitch, imagine you're pitching yourself to someone. You don't want to look scruffy, you don't want to look messy. So the same with your CV, that's their first impression of you. Why do you want to make mistakes? So make sure it's perfect. And again, you only submit a CV once, so there's only one chance with that for an employer. So don't make that a very basic error. There's another point around covering letters, and we'll touch on this later, but sometimes employers do require covering letters. These days it varies on the type of job, and it's not a necessity per se, especially as you progress through your career. But at the earlier stages of your career, they are quite effective, and often employers ask for them. There's a standard structure in terms of how to write a covering letter, and we can touch on that a bit later, but it's something that in some instances, sometimes people write a covering letter even if it's not required, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just shows your keenness, but it's not a necessity always. Now, next slide. So it's deliberately titled like this, Con Men. It's obviously common mistakes. We've talked about spelling errors. That's definitely a no-no. Don't make sure that it's perfect. Another bit is too much or too little information. So sometimes, and you'll be tempted to do this, especially in your early stages of your career, but sometimes if you can sort of put too much information about a particular experience when it's not warranted. So going back to the university example, my rule of thumb with every piece of experience, whether it's voluntary, work experience, or even university, or even a school, is to write 4 bullet points. So that's on average 4 lines, right? Basically, there's no need to write more than that. And to be honest, if you're writing more than that, you need to ask yourself why. Like, why is it really important? The reason for that is, like I said before, people don't spend a lot of time looking at CVs. And given that, for example, human resource professionals will be scanning through up to like hundreds of CVs potentially, everything starts to feel the same to them after a while. So you've really got to keep it relevant to that piece of experience rather than just waffling. Sometimes people do this, but they actually don't provide enough information. And again, this is where you're underselling yourself. So if you've done some work experience, and even if, for example, like I said before, the example I gave, working at Next, you can write more than a line, but it's how you convey it. So if you worked at Next and all your job was working behind a till or you were stacking the clothes, there are still transferable skills from that to, for example, working at a legal firm. So, one thing that everyone has to deal with in life is dealing with people, whether that's in Next or working at a legal firm. So you can convey those skills in your CV, and employers actually want to look for those sort of things. So don't hesitate to put that in. We talked about this earlier, but irrelevant details, no need to put age. Employers don't really care for those things these days. They're trying to avoid discriminating against people as well. So they're quite aware of these things, and so they'll try and screen these things out anyway. Personality, it's an elevator pitch, so it's not like a personal statement where perhaps you need to sort of talk about, why you got into the legal sector in the first place, but try and bring it to life. It shouldn't be robotic, i.e., okay, worked at Next for 2 years, climbed up from the till to manager. Try and add a little bit of personality, but again, it's a CV, so it's your professional side, so it doesn't need to flow as much as a personal statement, but it needs a little bit. Presentation, this is quite easy to fix. So if you go online and you just type in a CV template, there are lots of templates out there, and you can actually just use any template out there. And basically the key thing is just to make sure that it looks structured, so you've got the same format throughout. So for example, in my CV, I will put the company I worked at. For example, if I'm talking about careers, the career section, I'll put the company I worked at, the date next, and then the location. And then I'll have those 4 bullet points, and then a space, and then the same thing. So make sure that you have the same structure, because then it looks neat. If it's all over the place, the formatting is slightly off, again, going back to my earlier point, it just looks a bit scruffy. Think about how you present yourself. Dull vocabulary. So what we mean here is basically going into, when you're describing what you've done, try and think about what you're trying to convey, right? So if you said you've worked at Next, what have you learned from working at Next? What can you take to your next employer in terms of that experience? So try and really enhance what you've done, even if it's something as basic, for example, as working in a shop. Talk about how, you're responsible. For example, if you manage a team, how you managed a team of 5 people running a shop floor, or how you were responsible for settling the till payments at the end of the day. Try and really kind of showcase that rather than just say, you basically went to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, for example, or for example, you did a weekend job. And finally, too general. Again, this is quite common in people, for those who recently started out in their careers, but don't just put a generic CV out there, like use ChatGPT or just download something online and just basically kind of fill in some boxes. Try and make it personalized, try and showcase who you are, because it really is that elevator pitch. So earlier I talked about covering letters. This is basically, it's not a must. Sometimes employers do ask for it, sometimes they don't. You can always include them in when you're applying for a job. Now, there's a certain structure that you can follow, and again, everyone has a different style. I've historically always kept my covering letter to a page. Going back to my earlier point, people don't spend a lot of time looking at CVs and covering letters, so there's no point writing pages and pages. So the opening paragraph is, again, it's sort of a summary of your CV, so just kind of outlining who you are. So for example, if you're a university student, you can say, look, I've been studying economics at university, and noticed your role at noticed your vacant position as an economist at this bank, and I'm really keen on this role because of the experience that I have to date. And then you go into the next paragraph, you talk about why you want the job. So this is where you elaborate on your interests. So you talk about, okay, at university, for example, I did several modules on banking and finance, and I was really interested in the theory and how that intersects with modern day life. And that's what's made me apply for this role. So you really try and bring out that experience that you have to date into the role that you're applying for. And remember, with all of these things, always remember that there's no point trying to invent something you haven't done. If you don't have experience of something, there's no point saying, oh, I've got experience working as an economist, etc., because at the end of the day, the employer will work it out. They'll find out in the interview. So it's more about just showing what you've done to date, i.e. the experience that you have, why you want to take that to the next level. Now, the next paragraph is what you have to offer. So try and kind of demonstrate some of your skills and experience if you have them in this section. So just talk about, for example, if you've done certain modules at university, or for example, you've done any courses. These days, there's a lot of online courses that you can do to kind of brush up your skills, for example, especially in things like coding. And if that's relevant to the job, put that in. Again, try and make sure that it's relevant. Don't just talk about coding in a role that doesn't require it. For example, in a sales job, it's not really relevant. And then talk about why you're interested in the employer. And this is very easy, actually. These days, there's a lot of information that you can find online. For example, if you just do a quick Google search of any employer, 9 times out of 10, the big employers have a Wikipedia page. So just go on that and read a bit about the firm, perhaps go on their website. Every company who has a website always has an About Us section, and then they talk about their values, they talk about what they do. Those are the sort of things that really stand out when you're applying. And again, when you go to the interview stage, the employer will always ask you this question: why do you want to work for us? And so this is something that you can bring out in the covering letter. So what really interests you about this employer or this job? Like why this industry? And so again, quick Google search will give you that information. And then to close the covering letter, just basically say, thank you for considering my application. I look forward to hearing from you. Something very, short and sweet and polite, and sign it off. So it's basically a formal letter. This is another thing I just point out as a minor detail that some people do pick up on, but for those of you, a lot of people here probably aren't used to writing letters, certainly not in the old style, on a pen and paper. But when you write a letter, for example, if you write Dear Sir or Madam, typically when you're writing a cover letter, you write Dear Sir or Madam, because you won't know the name of the person, the hiring manager who's hiring for this role. If you write that, Dear Sir, Madam, and this is convention in the English language, but you never sign off for a letter with yours sincerely, because there's the rule, S and S don't match. Write yours faithfully. Don't write best or thank you. That's quite odd. Remember, this is a formal application. So make sure you don't make these small mistakes. Some employers do pick up on these things, especially if the person on the other side is quite old school and they're really into these finer details. So again, you can go online, look at templates, and it will basically give you something that you can use, but just check for these minor details. The next bit is, again, this isn't relevant per se to writing a CV, but it's important as part of your job kind of profile. So when you're applying, LinkedIn is, for those of you who aren't aware, is a social media network. So basically it's not like conventional social media in terms of it's not supposed to be used for, talking to people, as in like day-to-day chat with people. It's more for putting a professional version of you online. So it's quite easy to create. And basically, it's a way for you to actually, there's two functions to it. It's a way for you to connect with like-minded individuals in your industry or sector, but it's also a way for you to actually follow other companies and also look for jobs. And to be honest, these days, it's probably the number one tool used by most companies to actually market, publish any vacancies. So I would definitely create a profile if you don't have one. It's quite easy. And in terms of the structure, LinkedIn actually does all of it for you. So it actually has the various templates, and all you do is you fill it out. So you can use a lot of what you've put in in your LinkedIn profile. My advice is keep it slightly shorter, because people, if a recruiter is looking at your LinkedIn profile, they're not going to really spend too long looking through your profile. They'll just look through, just what sort of work experience you have or what you've done at university. So keep it to sort of 1 or 2 lines per section. But it's very, very useful. And as you progress through your career, especially more in the sort of professional sector, it's almost critical, because a lot of people find jobs through LinkedIn, either directly connecting through companies or seeing vacancies, or through just through that network. And networking, which we've talked about in the past, is very, very critical. So again, there's a few points on the benefits of networking. We ran a webinar previously on it, so I'm not really going to spend too much time on it, but networking is a key way for you to sort of branch out and grow in your industry and actually find your next role. Just finally, where to look for jobs. There's many sources out there, so this isn't an exhaustive list, but for those of you who are university, these are some common sites. So Reed to be honest, Reed has a plethora of vacancies. They kind of cover most industries, so it's both on the professional side, but even, for example, in the hospitality industry, even for more casual jobs, they tend to have jobs posted on there. LinkedIn tends to be your larger companies, corporates with vacancies. Indeed is similar to Reed as well, in terms of it has, it covers a lot of industries. Same with Monster Jobs. Total, again, is a bit more geared towards kind of the professional sector, but there's lots and lots of sites out there. And then, like we said here, recruiters as well. There are many, many recruiters. So my advice to you is, if you're ever, when you start looking for a job, the way to, and let's say you're looking in an industry that you've never worked in before, you've got no experience, the way to go about it is, first step is, I always do this, I type in top 50 recruiters in, and then you put your industry. So let's say I'm looking for a job in the fashion industry. I'll say top 50 recruiters in the fashion industry. And I'll go through the sort of first 5 or 6 hits on Google, and I'll basically make a list of those recruiters, and then I'll go on their website and just see what sort of jobs they recruit for in the fashion industry. And typically they'll explain the sort of level of seniority they recruit for as well, because some recruiters exclusively recruit higher up in the industry, some recruit more at the entry level. So it's obviously important to contact the right recruiter. So there's no harm going through recruiters, because often they can help you get a job. And my second approach is to basically then I'll write top 50 companies in the fashion industry. So I put companies here, because again, most these days, there's on Google, you can basically find a list of all the biggest companies in an industry. And when you're applying for jobs, it's the law of large numbers. But basically, if you apply to a bigger company, they're going to have more jobs available. So those are my first 2 port of calls in terms of creating that market map, or the universe of the potential jobs out there. Now, obviously, if you know what you want to do, or for example, you've got like a specific sector that you want to work in, or certain companies, then another approach is to just type in, for example, if you're looking for a data analyst position, data analyst job within pharmaceuticals. And then some of these sites, typically these sort of aggregator sites, will pop up, and then it'll have a list of all the jobs. But that process can be sometimes not as focused as applying to the biggest companies. So it really depends on your approach. And then the last sort of string to your bow is basically going to the company itself. So let's say, for example, there's a small set of companies that you want to apply to. Let's say you want to work in tech. So for example, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. You can go on their website and look at career vacancies. Some of these companies even operate, these sort of notification tools whereby if there isn't a vacancy but you're looking for a specific job, you can basically put your details down and it'll automatically contact you should a vacancy become available. So sorry. So lastly, so that was the end of the presentation. Does anyone have any questions, or I was going to go through the questions that people had submitted through the registration form, and I'll basically kind of try and answer them because some of them were quite specific, so it's hard to put in the slides. If you feel free to unmute or put it into the chat. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the questions here. Hopefully everyone can see these. The first question was, if you're applying for a technical job, how technical should the content be? There's always a balance. Like I said before, earlier on in terms of advice, make it personable. If you're applying for, say, a data scientist role, don't just talk about data science and how, you've got said skills in data science and make it very technical. Try and have a balance. And that's where I explained earlier, for example, if you've done some volunteering work or you're quite involved in the organization, put that in, because then that shows that there's different sides to you. Like I said before, employers don't want robot. They want someone who's actually has some personality. So keep a balance between the two. Don't just put in very technical details into your CV. Next question, we've covered it. How many pages? So like I said, there's no right or wrong. Early on in your career, you might just want 1 page. Later on, as you get more experience, 2 pages. In terms of platforms, there's many. If you just type in CV template into Google, you can just get a template and then you can just edit from there. We've talked a little bit about the CV and personal statement, so I won't really go over that again. I got this question, established career. I'm not sure what they exactly mean by that, but I'll try and read between the lines. If you're already established in your career and you're thinking about the next step, i.e., okay, how do I get to the next level? The way to go about doing this is actually to think about what you're applying for, i.e., the next job. What would you be doing in that job, and what skills and relevant experience do you already have in your current job that already kind of showcase you're ready to make that leap? So let's say, for example, you're working at a legal firm, or let's say an accounting firm, and you want to make the jump up to manager. Now, you may not have the experience, i.e. the direct experience of managing people at this point in time, but what experience do you have that gives the employer the confidence that you could step into that role and you wouldn't struggle? So for example, if you worked on some projects where you had to kind of lead a team of people, those are the sort of things that you should put into your CV. So think about it like this: how can I basically show that I've already got the skills to move into the next role? I got a question on CV writing for mature adults. Again, I'm not too sure what was meant by that, but I'll try and read between the lines. So if you're a mature adult and you've got some experience, for example, you don't need to change your CV per se in terms of change the style or the structure. You can keep the format like I mentioned earlier in terms of, that sort of relevant experience at the top, and then, any sort of voluntary experience, extracurricular stuff later on. The only thing that you can do is, and I think that was one of the questions here, is it was around gaps in your career. If you have had gaps, then try and basically explain those, but explain it in a way that gives the employer comfort that they shouldn't be too worried about you. So I'll explain this. I'll explain what I mean by this. So as you progress through your career, there might be times when you might be out of work for a few years, and there's always valid reasons. For example, you might have childcare duties or caring duties, or even for personal reasons like health, you might not be able to work. Now, you can never lie on your CV, or you should never lie. And the reason for this is it looks really bad when you lie, because often once an employer offers you a job, most employers out there, 99% will do a background screening check where they'll go to an external company, and that company will do sort of a background search on you. These days it's quite extensive. They even check your social media accounts. So again, you got to be very careful in terms of what you post on social media. But they do a background check to see if your CV lines up with your actual what's happened in your life. So by that, what I mean is, if you say you worked at said company for 5 years, they'll contact that company and get confirmation that you worked at that company for 5 years. If, for example, at that point you've then said you worked at another company for 2 years, but in reality you had a 1 year break, they'll contact that second company, and if that reference doesn't come back, then it'll be flagged. And at that point, if you have to explain to your employer, your prospective employer, that actually you told a lie and you said you worked there for 2 years, but in reality it was 1 year, it's not going to look good. And the employer, in some instances, they have full right to basically rescind their employment offer, because at the end of the day, your job hasn't started, right? So most employers do these background checks before you start your job. So it's really important that you tell the truth, but there's a way to structure it. So for example, if you've been out of employment for some time, and you're basically you're thinking about how to sort of explain that, the best way to do it is try and spin it into little positives. So for example, if you've been out of work for health reasons, and it happened, there are times when we can't work, try and say, okay, you can just put one line where you say, I was out of work, off work for a period of time. But if you did anything during that period, for example, you did some extracurricular activities, you brushed up on some skills, put those sort of things in. So it kind of shows them that you weren't just off for basically a year and did nothing. Because employers are always worried that basically you're going to work for them, you're going to join that company, but then for whatever reason you're going to be off sick, or you want me to work for them, and then you're going to be on their payroll. So it's really important that you try and explain these gaps, but try and soften it, try and put a positive spin on it. Few more questions. So we just talked about the gap period or absence from work. So hopefully that answers whoever asked that question, but if it doesn't, I'm happy to go into more detail. But you don't need to spend 4 lines talking about why you were out of work. You can just put 1 line, but basically try and put a little spin on it, like a positive spin, in terms of showing like, okay, I was off work for a year because I was on maternity leave, but you did something during that period, which just shows that you've kept in touch with the industry. This question: how do you incorporate the SAR organization in my CV and personal statement? So in terms of a CV, the way I've incorporated my experiences in the organization is, I haven't spelt out all my roles in the organization, because again, like I said before, think about the number of words you have, think about what you're putting in your CV, really keep it concise, don't waste your words. So I haven't put 3 paragraphs in what I've done in the organization. I have 3 lines where I've just described the sort of projects I've worked on. And again, I always relate it to my skill set. So in terms of my experience in the SAR organization, I've led many projects, whether it's doing homeless saver or blood donor drives. So I've mentioned those sort of things and talked about how I've project managed some of these initiatives. So that's both showcasing the voluntary work that I've done, so the different side, the personal side, but at the same time, I put my skill set in as well. I hope that answers the question, but if not, please feel free to unmute or put something in the chat. Is there anything we should avoid writing on our CV? There's yes and no. I mean, the main thing is, again, if you're pitching yourself to someone, don't show the negative side to yourself or the weakness. So don't say, oh, I struggle with time management, or I struggle to work to deadlines, or I'm disorganized, because that sort of thing is a red flag to an employer. So try and basically, whatever you do, try and put the positive spin on your CV. So, try and, if you're talking about work experience, use affirmative words, i.e., words that basically positive statements. To say, I was responsible for leading a team of 5, managed the the shop floor. Try and show a positive side to what you've done, rather than basically the kind of, oh, I was late for work, or I struggled to meet deadlines and missed such and such deadline. Those are not okay. For those of you old and looking to work completely different, best way to structure a CV. So if you're older and you're looking to make a career change, i.e., go from one industry to another, to be honest, the way to structure your CV is you still need to put the experience that you have to date, because ultimately that's what you're going to take to your next job. But what you need to do is you need to kind of demonstrate to your employer why you want to make this change, i.e., why is it worth them taking a chance on you? What's the rationale? So what I would do is I would include that intro paragraph that I mentioned at the start, where you talk about your experience today, and mention one line where you kind of explain why you're trying to make that pivot in the industry, i.e., why is it that you want to move from, say, the legal sector to the fashion industry. And then throughout your CV, like I said before, making sure that your skill set aligns to the job, try and tailor what you've written, i.e., the skills that you've basically picked up to date, to the job that you're applying for. So even though the legal sector is very different to the fashion sector, there is always transferable skills that you can take from one job to another. So try and put those skills and that experience into the CV. So, for example, if in the fashion industry you're working on more projects, try and basically bring that out in your CV. I say, in your experience working as a lawyer, you worked on several projects. Really kind of give off that impression that you've got a lot of project management experience. Equally, if there's a reason why you want to make that industry pivot, i.e., you've done certain courses, you basically upskilled, mention that in your CV. In terms of your kind of extracurricular or kind of additional skills, you can always have another section saying skills. Mention these skills, say, I've done such and such course, etc. And then the employer is going to know, okay, this person is looking to make that pivot. So employers understand, it's quite common, people wanting to move industries, but you just need to kind of give them some context. Keywords. So the keywords, and like I said at the start, these days AI looks through CVs, is basically try and make sure that the words, those skills that you mentioned, align with the job profile. So whenever you look through a job profile, always look at what they're asking for. So if it's a sales role, they're going to talk about being able to meet clients, meet targets, present to clients, etc. So really those are the sort of words that you need to kind of have in your CV, or for example, basically kind of talk about in terms of your skill set. These days, with the advent of AI, you could get ChatGPT to write a CV for you and basically put in these keywords. But think about it like this: the employer can take said CV, the same CV, and put it into ChatGPT, and it'll basically tell them what keywords have been put in, and it'll spot these kind of tricks. It'll spot these sort of glaring errors. So don't just drop in keywords for the sake of it. You have to kind of show what experience you have and how that's relevant. We covered these things: picture, cover note, changing your CV depending on the job you're applying for. Touched a bit on maternity leave as well, and talking about gaps, listing duties. Okay, demonstrate achievement. So we've talked a bit about this, but whenever you write something in a CV, don't talk about the how, also talk a bit about the why. So if you've achieved something, you got a scholarship at university, or for example, you've basically came out with a distinction in your masters, or you did something else at work, for example, you won an award, try and actually just explain, give some context behind that. So you got this award at work. Talk about what you did, i.e., I went the extra mile, or I basically solved an extra 50 cases at work, which led me to being awarded this, given this recognition. So try and actually give them some context behind like how you won that award. Don't just say, okay, I won this award and that's it. Those are all the questions. Does anyone else have anything on the chat or want to unmute or anything that's not clear? Sorry, let me just go back. Okay, so if you do have any questions, like I mentioned at the start, feel free to either contact myself or Brother Keithy on either on personal statements or CV writing. Here are my details. So if you do have any questions specifically related to your CV, feel free to email me, or you can even send me a text or WhatsApp. I'm more than happy to give you some advice or help, even just looking at your CV and just giving you a second opinion. Like I said at the start, I will be emailing these slides to everyone who joined this call. Everyone who's registered, after this session. So if you don't have any more questions, we will end with 1 Om and 3 Shantis. But thank you for joining this session, and I hope you found it useful. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Sorry everyone, thank you for joining.